Thank you all for being here. Our project is called Tools for Change: Policy Levers to Electrify Buildings at the State and Local Level. And the basic aim of our project was to put together a set of policy priorities for state lawmakers who want to increase home electrification in their jurisdictions.
So the lay of the land and what we're going to do is first introduce ourselves and then talk through a little bit about what it is that we're trying to solve for and how we're trying to do it in our theory of change. The meat and potatoes of the presentation are going to be in the methodology of how we got to the recommended list of policies that we want to put forward, and then some case studies on how this has worked in the real world and ways that we can implement it and what we're actually going to do next. So who are we?
I'm Kelsey Dunn. I'm a joint law student and master's student.
I'm Daniel Hoof. I'm a joint MS and MBA student. So what's the problem in the theory of change?
We started out by identifying the social need, which is that residential and commercial buildings are still a huge portion of overall greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And our general approach was to empower state lawmakers to take action on this issue by coming up with a process for identifying priorities based on high benefit and low legal risk.
And then the plan is to focus the analysis specifically on New Mexico as the state in order to have actionable and practical recommendations that we can make happen in the real world. So in thinking through the methodology and the analysis, there's kind of three big broad brushstroke buckets to think through. The first is there's a huge universe of policy levers out there that you could theoretically pull to help electrify homes at a state, right? So the first thing is to just A through Z, what are all of the different policy options? And the premise of the project really is to spend some time getting down to the specifics of which one we should focus on. Then we look at who are the state actors that we could consider. So that's everyone from a small little town to a city to county level through to state legislature, and then figure out which one we want to focus on, and we'll talk about why we did that later. And then do the legal and cost benefit analysis to figure out which of those policies is both practicable and also gets your biggest bang for your buck on a bunch of different criteria. And that is how we end up with our policy priority areas. So this is the universe. There are a lot of things on this page. I promise I'm not going to talk through all of them. But the point of it is to show both that there are a lot of things and also to show how we focused on the state legislature as the point of analysis, because it's there that a lot of decisions are made, but also it's where state revenues are collected, which means that anything to do with money around incentives and penalties typically get levied at the state level. And so there are many more tools that are available in the toolkit, and that's where we wanted to spend our time. So in thinking through the methodology, once we get to that kind of bucket, how do we prioritize within it? I focused on a cost-benefit analysis, and Kelsey focused on a legal analysis. And within the cost-benefit analysis, there were a couple of major buckets, right? Unsurprisingly, what is the cost and the gain to state revenue and to the economy? This, for policy people will know, is kind of very standard in how you think about policy implications that, for example, have a tax where you are gaining state revenue but might have a penalty in terms of economic activity. The next also is kind of self-explanatory, right? Climate impact, what's your bang for your buck on that front? The last two, I think, are particularly interesting because they're often ones that aren't talked about in an academic context. One is, what is the political feasibility of any given policy choice? As in, can a politician who has pushed this through the legislature get reelected the next time they stand before voters? And the last is an equity consideration of how does this policy impact marginalized communities or those that maybe are not often considered in the broader scheme of how policy is enacted.
And then I focused on the legal risk analysis, which again is rarely layered on in this way to a cost benefit analysis. But in the climate context, when we have such a short window to take significant action, really matters because litigation can really delay implementation of these policies. So I was really looking at three main questions. The first is there precedent on this issue? Has a court ruled either in favor of this policy being within state authority or ruled against it? And then second, I was looking at what were the legal theories that were used in those cases or in analogous policy situations that might apply to the building context? And a significant issue is preemption. So has the federal government already carved out exclusive authority in this regulatory area? And then similarly, should states consider carving out exclusive authority in this area and prevent local governments from acting on it? And then third, if there wasn't sort of an analogous situation or existing precedent, I asked whether this was a type of policy that is in the traditional authority of states, and that tends to be police powers of providing for the health, safety, and welfare of citizens. We also wanted to point out a couple of limitations at this stage. The first is that we really took a high-level review of the issue, looking for broad insights rather than specific numbers. Second, this is a very new policymaking space, so the state-specific data is limited and state actors will have to consider that. And third, we do make reference to areas where federal interventions like new regulation or new funding streams may be relevant, but don't go very deep into it. So this is our general policy priority output. We divided into 3 different categories: top priority, which are things that states should really consider doing right now because they are high benefit and probably low legal risk, or at least worth the legal risk. And we have six types of policies in that bucket. Second are medium priority issues that states should consider doing later or on the near-term horizon, but maybe don't need to be immediately prioritized now. And then third, items that we think should be deprioritized because the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't work out, or because there are significant legal hurdles, or the court has already decided that this isn't an area for state action.
So thinking through those 6 areas that we identified, we grouped them into 4 kind of elements on our universe map that you saw earlier. So the first is this bucket of things related to HVAC and heat pumps. So that is incentives, and it's also emission standards specific to different kinds of HVAC equipment. Those 2 were particularly effective and the things that we would prioritize. Then the second bucket is kind of energy efficiency standards or emissions standards that apply both in terms of new construction with building codes, and also another sort of tool that's quite useful and important is ratcheting emissions standards for existing buildings. And we'll talk about that in a sec. Those 2 things together kind of cover all buildings because it's new buildings and existing stock. So that has pretty significant impact. And then the third bucket is rebates and incentives for solar panels and batteries. That's a relatively self-explanatory one because it's a big bang for your buck from a climate perspective and relatively easy to do politically. And then the last that's very interesting is utility regulation, given that there's a bunch of really cool things that you can do around rate structures and net metering and virtual power plant that we think is worth exploring as well. So what we're going to do with the last few minutes of our presentation is talk through 3 case studies of what has happened in other states across the US in some of these areas. That's not to say that the others aren't important, it's just that we only have time for these ones. And in those case studies, what we're thinking about is in what ways could we use those tools from other states to practice in New Mexico? So the first case study that we found interesting is the Technology and Equipment for Clean Heating, or TEC, set of policies from California. This is designed to solve for the gap between the current cost between HVAC, heat pump equipment, both in terms of space heating and in terms of water heating, versus gas. And you'll see that it's big at the front and small at the back because over time, the expectation is that heat pumps will become cheaper, and also that the concomitant benefits will rise as more heat pumps come online, and that's kind of this green chunk, which means that the incentive gets tailed off over time through to 2030. The other thing that I'll call out that's super interesting about this is the way it's funded, in that it is a cap and trade system amongst gas utilities, which means that there isn't actually any funds coming out of state coffers for this, which makes it politically more viable. They've raised about $116 million for this, so it's actually material impact and change. So from a cost-benefit perspective, it checks a lot of boxes and makes this a very interesting case for New Mexico.
And then from a legal perspective, this is relatively low risk because this type of policy is relatively mature in other sectors and other contexts. We know that states are generally allowed to set up these kinds of market structures. Our second case study is zero-emission HVAC standards in California. These are aimed at natural gas furnaces and water heaters and really target manufacturers by placing deadlines by which manufacturers can no longer sell or install furnaces that emit air pollutants that create smog, so things like nitrogen oxides. And this is a really interesting issue because the only types of appliances that meet those criteria right now are electric appliances. So it's a way to get at the appliances issue without specifically mandating certain appliances be installed.
And the cost benefit of this is quite good because the state doesn't have to pay anything. The political ramifications are things is sort of still evolving because while this is certainly works in California, it might well be more difficult across other states because you're kind of getting at banning utilities in a way that is politically complicated. So that the jury is still out, but it could be a really effective way to get at that problem.
Similarly, from a legal perspective, this is something that has more intermediate risk because it is so novel. And we already know that things like trying to ban gas stoves directly tend to be extremely controversial. So it's unclear whether or not this will lead to litigation, but thus far it hasn't. It's also an interesting legal issue because it's a place where local governments have taken action, but then the state government at the CARB level has also tried to act in this space. So it might be an area where state preemption is relevant. And then our third case study is about building energy efficiency standards. And again, this is an area where we've seen both city level innovation and state level innovation. Local Law 97 is one that sets caps on carbon emissions directly and ratchets them down over time, focusing specifically on large commercial and residential buildings. And then in the Washington case, it sets energy efficiency targets rather than caps on carbon specifically, but is meant to get at the same idea in large buildings.
So the thing that's super interesting about this from a politics standpoint is that you can use cities as kind of a laboratory of democracy, and then apply some of those learnings at a state level when thinking about state policy. This also has similar benefits of no cost to the state, though there are a lot of loud voices in New York right now that are crying out about the economic impacts of Local Law 97. There's also a lot of analysis that has said that the economic activity that comes from retrofitting those buildings is also significant. So that's the jury is still out there, but there's a lot of really interesting work being done specifically on the economic impacts of that.
And then from a legal perspective, this is relatively low risk because it's aimed at building codes, which have traditionally been an area of state authority.
So how does this happen for real? We have a whole slate of state legislators that we're talking to now and are going to continue to talk to over the next couple weeks and months, ranging from sort of younger to older, top of the state, bottom of the state, and the chair of the Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee. And then as we're going through those conversations, we will also think through the implications kind of at the county and at the city level, and have already lined up a couple of people that we think would be interesting to talk to on that front. Thank you.
So to this idea of states and municipalities being, sort of testing ground for policy and potential adaptation, how does preemption come into that and into play there? It seems like it's something that is increasingly happening at state levels of preempting communities from being able to actually take adaptive action. What do you think the future on that is? I guess this is more for you, Kelsey.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the future is. We've seen things go both ways. Like we've seen some states say that explicitly say that localities can't take action in certain spaces, like can't decide to ban new gas infrastructure, for instance. But I also think that preemption can be a force for making these processes move more quickly. For example, having a state level energy efficiency program that sets caps for all buildings in the state versus focusing on just one locality might be a benefit. So it's hard to say first which direction the trend is going into, whether it's positive or negative. And I think it's all of the above in different situations.
First, I may have misunderstood how you're doing benefit cost analysis, but you kept saying things like there's no cost because the state doesn't have to pay
To the state.
to the state. Most benefit cost analysis I think of is you look at the benefits and costs to all people involved, including the people that are being regulated. Like the benefits and costs to the people who want to have gas stoves as well as others. Have you integrated that type of benefit cost analysis in what you're doing?
Yes. So when I said that, that was a shorthand that actually was more referring to the political component, because when states have to spend money that they previously weren't, there is a political ramification to that. The economic cost benefit analysis, together with the state income and cost gains and all those things, those get factored together in the overall economic piece. So that does get factored in. It is. It's just not what I was referring to at the time.
Thank you. And then a little suggestion. When you talk about the technology for equipment for clean heating and cooling, you have a learning by doing, and you're justifying the rate at which you're doing it by the degree of learning by doing that you have integrated into there, I believe. Have you solved that as an optimization problem and figured out what the actually appropriate rate is and the actual appropriate taxes based upon the results of an optimization? If you haven't, I'm going to direct you shamelessly. I'm going to direct you to a paper by Ken Gillingham, Arthur Van Bentham, and me that were looking at this initial optimal solar taxation, solar subsidies for going into California. Back when Schwarzenegger was thinking about it, that shows how you can choose that as an optimization, and it shows what type of subsidies that you would do. And you may want to take a look at that to integrate that type of logic into what you've done, because as you described it, it looked a little ad hoc to me.
I would absolutely like to look at that paper. We have not, but yeah, sure.